attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Hello, everyone. This is Andy Steele, and I'm glad to be back again. Today, the guest is going to be Lance deHaven-Smith, and we're going to be talking about the term conspiracy theory, where it comes from, and how that term has been used for decades to marginalize and demonize people who raise questions about major crimes like 9/11. He's got a book out now about this subject called Conspiracy Theory in America. We'll be diving into his research and how that relates to the current information battle over the fact that the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7 were brought down in a pre-planned controlled demolition on 9/11. So stay tuned. This is an interview that I've been looking forward to all week, and this is going to be one that you want to share with others. So here we are, another week, and the fight to expose the reality of what happened to the buildings in New York on 9/11 does march on. And if you go to ae911truth.org, you'll see some of the latest news there. And one of the articles on the page is this: 9/11 Consensus Panel backs Rethink 9/11 Global Ad Campaign. That's right, the 9/11 Consensus Panel has announced that it is honored to join the growing list of organizations from around the world that are supporting Rethink 9/11. And as you know, that's the global ad campaign that's rolling out this September. It's going to include, among other things, a big billboard in Times Square that's going to bring Building 7 to people's attention. So to find out more about this, you just got to go to rethink911.org. We talk a lot about this campaign on the show. And the 9/11 Consensus Panel itself was founded by Dr. David Ray Griffin, and that's a name that comes up a lot on this program from guests who say that he was a big part of waking them up to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence, and that includes Richard Gage. Now, the purpose of the 9/11 Consensus Panel, if you're not aware of that, is to provide the world with a clear statement based on expert independent opinion of some of the best evidence that challenges the official narrative about 9/11. And this includes opinions of respected authorities based on their professional experience and studies, based on physical data, and that includes photographs, videos, court testimony, witness reports, and Freedom of Information Act releases, and, of course, direct evidence, too. And that really reflects the spirit of AE 9/11 Truth, too, and it reflects the spirit of this show and what I try to do. You know, obviously, my guests are individuals with their own opinions and their own political beliefs, and they may have their own comfort levels on voicing what parties they think were responsible for the controlled demolitions of the buildings on 9/11, but what unites all of us is, of course, the science. And that's because the science is plain and simple, and it can't be denied, all right? And that is the route that is going to reach the most people. And that is why you should be learning it and spreading it wherever you can. And the best way to do that, of course, is to show others the movies that are put out by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and those are Blueprint for Truth and 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. And you can watch those movies for free on the internet, or you can get the DVDs at the AE 9/11 Truth store and show them places. You know, I mean, beyond doing that, you also need to click the volunteer tab on the right-hand side of the screen, and you got to let AE 9/11 Truth know what you can do for this important cause. All right, no matter what your skills are, there is something that you can do. And I love seeing the creativity of people shine when they're doing something for this fight. I've seen people write songs, they make cool art. I've seen them make bicycle marquees. It's all pretty neat, and it really reflects the human spirit. There's creativity in fighting this tremendous battle. And even myself, I find I've picked up on a number of skills being in this fight since 2006. In terms of making videos and music editing, web page design, and I've also acquired some cool technology I wouldn't have normally gotten just out of the necessity of doing what I have to do for this movement. So it's kind of like a country that innovates for some kind of national effort, and as a result, it has all these new technologies, new industries available that are spinning off for public use. So by volunteering for AE 9/11 Truth and doing everything you can to spread the controlled demolition evidence, you can actually better yourself and learn things that you can put to use in other areas of life. And seriously, when this truth is exposed, I mean, it's exposed now, but when it's widely known and accepted, and in the history books, you'll be able to tell people that, you had this and that experience helping AE 9/11 Truth expose the crime of the century. And that will come in handy, believe me. So there's no reason not to volunteer. So again, AE911truth.org. Go there now. Do whatever you can to help out. All right, this week in C-SPAN 9/11 Truth Calls, I got 3 clips here, and I'm not going to play them in order of when they happened, but rather in order of what I thought were the most interesting responses from the guests. Now, they all happened last week, and the first clip I'm going to play is from Thursday, July the 11th, and the guest is Representative Elliot Engel. He's a Democrat from New York. He's a House Foreign Affairs Committee ranking member. So we're going to play that right now.
Congressman Elliot Engel, Democrat of New York, representing the 16th District, Westchester, Bronx area. Dina is up next, Poughkeepsie, New York, Democrat. Hi, Dina.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call, Congressman. Since the public approval of Congress is an all-time low, I feel like when we are critical of our government or ask questions that we are shot down or not answered at all. That being said, since Congress refuses to look at the overwhelming evidence that explosives destroyed Building 7 on 9/11, that's the 3rd building not hit by a plane.
Dina, where are you getting your information from?
There have been peer-reviewed papers that are unrefuted.
Well, I'll refute it.
Go ahead, Congressman.
That's not anything that I've ever heard or read on 9/11. We know what happened. People went into the World Trade Center, hijacked 2 planes, Saudi Arabian Islamic radicals, and killed 2,000 people in my hometown of New York City. So these conspiracy theories and these other theories, they might sound intriguing, but they have no basis in fact, as far as I'm concerned.
How much do you hear people talking about this, and where do you think that comes from?
I don't hear too much of it. Occasionally you'll hear it, and it just comes from the fact that people want to believe what they want to believe. I think that there's nothing that I've read or heard or seen that would indicate that anything short of those 2 planes that went into the World Trade Center and killed 2,000 innocent people, nothing else did that. It was the evil hijacking of those airplanes that did it.
Now, there you heard it, folks. The caller gets cut off before she can finish the question. Now, in fairness to Libby Casey, the host there, she may have just cut the caller off out of confusion because Mr. Engel jumped in and claimed he was going to refute what the caller said with his uninformed response, and he took over the flow of the conversation. That's what it seemed to me if you watch it. But of course, his response was typical and silly. He didn't even address Building 7. Either he has no listening comprehension abilities whatsoever, or he didn't want to listen, and that's more likely. I think if any of his constituents are listening, they should obviously confront the man further on this topic. Public appearances that he might be at, write an editorial in your hometown paper. You know how to do it, all right? Get the confrontation on tape if you can. Be respectful but firm. Okay, our next clip is from July the 13th. The guest is Stuart Reed. He's a senior editor at Foreign Affairs magazine, and he was on the program talking about Rand Paul that day, trying to isolate Rand Paul from the GOP and from the voters because Rand Paul is not cool with the prospect of drone striking Americans. The host that day was Steve Scully, and if you remember, Scully's the one at the end of the last C-SPAN compilation video getting all huffy and telling a caller, and really addressing all callers, to take their 9/11 controlled demolition question somewhere else. Interestingly enough, though, that didn't seem to work for him because here he is getting another call about Building 7.
Stuart Reed, who is a graduate of Dartmouth College, New Hampshire, senior editor for Foreign Affairs magazine, and has also written a piece for Washington Monthly on the education of the Republican Party. Hamilton is joining us from New York City on the Republican line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for taking my question.
Sure.
Question for you, Stuart. Since 9/11 is the basis of so much of our foreign policy, why isn't Foreign Affairs magazine doing more to cover the nearly 2,000 architects and engineers demanding a real investigation of why building number 7 fell?
You know, it's interesting. I think the caller's conspiracy theory really taps into one of the problems with Rand Paul's support is that he hasn't sufficiently distanced himself from people believing, offensive things that are completely lacking in evidence, such as what the caller brought up. And so if Rand Paul is going to really have a campaign that can go national, he'll have to learn how to dismiss people and distance himself from people with views like those.
So Reed uses the question as a way to make a jab at Rand Paul, and that's interesting because I've talked before on the show about how these corporate media people will try to use what they perceive as mass disdain for those who question 9/11 against politicians they don't like. If they perceive that that politician has any kind of support from people that question the official story of 9/11, they'll try to use them as a weapon against them. But that doesn't work anymore because more people are waking up. So, eventually they're not going to be able to distance themselves from all of America. And now finally we have this clip, and it's of Senator Roger Wicker. Now this is from July the 9th, and I really want you out there to hear his response.
That more would have to be done.
All right, back to phone calls here. Huntington, West Virginia. Nick is a Republican. Good morning.
Morning. Thank you for taking my call, and thank you, C-SPAN, for keeping this national forum for us all to have this public debate. So, Senator, I'd just like to ask one question, and I'll take my answer off the air. That's okay?
Sure.
Okay. How much money do you think military and security contractors would lose if members of Congress were required to know basic physics and acknowledge that Building 7's 105 feet of free fall on 9/11 is only possible if explosives were used, since no plane actually hit Building 7? And I'll take my response off the air. Thank you.
Well, I wish you well in West Virginia, and thanks for the nice shout out for C-SPAN, which I support. I guess there are always going to be people like the caller who believe that the Twin Towers came down on September 11, 2001 because of explosions rather than because of the crashing of airplanes. I think that's a settled issue. But this is the great thing about free speech in America. The caller is perfectly free to continue to urge his position and to convince as many people as he possibly can that he's correct.
And the whole point of our show, there is an organized effort out there. In case our viewers are wondering, we get phone calls frequently from one group in particular who has mobilized their folks to call into this show in particular and question our guests, members of Congress, whoever, about what happened on 9/11.
Right, well, I will tell you, as much as I disagree with them and cannot see how their reasoning holds up, I have close personal friends who feel the same way. So there you go.
Now, I'll tell you what. I obviously don't agree with Senator Wicker's position, but I appreciate his honest sentiments, and what I see is a complete absence of arrogance on his part, which is obviously a good quality. And indeed, that's a pretty big deal that a U.S. Senator openly admits that he has close personal friends who believe the same as the caller does about 9/11. So even though I think Senator Wicker has a lot to learn about Building 7, in my view, his answer qualifies him for a grade of B-. And I think that's the highest grade I've ever given on this show for these politicians' responses so far. Of course, the other two guys before him give big fat Fs. That should go without saying. But B- for Wicker. Write to me if you don't agree. That's freefall911truth@gmail.com. Okay, before I introduce our guest today, we're going to take 10 seconds of silence, as we always do, to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families, and all the people who have died in the wars that followed 9/11. So we're going to do that now. And that is 10 seconds. Okay, my guest today is Dr. Lance deHaven-Smith. Dr. deHaven-Smith is a professor in the Reubin O'D Askew School of Public Administration and Policy at Florida State University. He received his BA degree from the University of Georgia, summa cum laude, and his MA and Ph.D. from the Ohio State University. In 2006, a peer-reviewed journal article, he coined the term state crimes against democracy to delineate a crime category for Watergate, Iran-Contra, Plame-gate, and other conspiracies in high office. His research has been highlighted in special issues of American Behavioral Scientist and Public Integrity. He has appeared on Good Morning America, The Today Show, NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw, CBS Nightly News with Dan Rather, The Jim Lehrer NewsHour, CNN, NPR, and other national and TV and radio shows, including this one here today, folks. His new book, Conspiracy Theory in America, was published in April of 2013 by the University of Texas Press. Sir, thank you for coming on the show.
I'm glad to be on, Andy.
Now, you cover a wide range of topics in your research, and it's so interesting to look at all of these. I urge people to do that. The focus of this show is about about 9/11, the building destructions that took place in New York. But the fact is, your research lines right up with our mission here, because most times when somebody questions a politician or a person in media about the controlled demolition evidence, they're marginalized as a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist. So to start off with, so we can get an understanding better of yourself, with regard to 9/11, what made you start questioning that event and start speaking out about it?
Well, I was informed by David Ray Griffin, of course, and Richard Gage, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. But I had also been in Tallahassee when the 2000 election occurred. That's the capital of Florida. I am a political scientist. One of my areas of expertise is Florida government and politics and Florida history. And I knew the law. I knew how the election recount should have been carried out and so on. And I saw a number of crimes committed. I wrote a book about this called The Battle for Florida, which was published by the University Presses of Florida, and identified specific crimes, felonies, that were committed. And I actually thought that they would be investigated after the election. I thought, well, in the heat of all this, it would be hard to deal with. But later, people would go back and hold public officials accountable who were responsible for administering the election. And that didn't happen. Quite the opposite. People insisted that you get over it and move on and so on. And so I started thinking about crime, political crime, and like I say, I wrote the book on the election. And as I came to question 9/11, I also started thinking back about all the other things that had happened in American politics in my lifetime. The assassination of President Kennedy, the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the attempted assassination of George Wallace, the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, and other election phenomena like the October surprise of 1980. There was also an October surprise in 1968 when the peace talks were sabotaged by Nixon. Anyway, I sat down and wrote a list of these things, and it stunned me how many there were. And I concluded that about 3/4, or at least half of the elections since 1960 had some major thing. I mean, like, a president being assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated the night he won the California Democratic primary and was going to go on and be president, and he was killed then. So that was an election phenomenon. And, of course, the 2000 election. And then 2004 was stolen. I mean, it appeared there's a lot of evidence to think it was stolen in the fact that the exit polls differed from the election returns in 10 out of 11 states. A statistician at the University of Pennsylvania, Stephen Freeman, did a study calculating the odds of having these differences between the election outcome and the exit polls, and found that the odds were, billions to one. It was just, totally beyond chance that this would have happened. So I started thinking about this, and I wrote an article in 2005 that was published after a lot of work, a lot of reviews in Administration Theory and Praxis, a journal for public administration. And it coined this term, state crimes against democracy. I coined the term because what I found was that the term conspiracy theory, which was so widely used, was totally disruptive of reason. It cut off debate. I mean, that's essentially what it does, is it stops people from talking. It just dismisses them. You don't sit down and talk about the evidence. You don't sit down and go through the questions about the official accounts and so on. And I didn't know it at the time. I gradually came across a CIA memo that was written in 1967. It was released by mistake in 1976. And this was when all these reports were coming out about the USA efforts to commit assassinations overseas and infiltrate the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the 60s. And so a lot of things came out. It was reported in the New York Times, but it was just one story one day and nobody ever covered it after that. Well, what the CIA had done is launched a global propaganda campaign to ridicule people who disagreed with the Warren Commission report that said the assassination of President Kennedy was by a lone gunman and there was no help from the government. And this campaign popularized the conspiracy theory concept. They had effectively what the CIA did was inject into public discourse this term, conspiracy theory, and equated it with being paranoid and harebrained and just out of bounds entirely and irrational. And the term, you can see it now. We have tools to track this. We have Google Ngram search. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Google has a tool that you can identify when words appear in time. They've scanned in millions of books, and you can do a word search. So you can find conspiracy theory and see when it starts being used. And sure enough, it starts being used after the Kennedy assassination, the assassination of President Kennedy. So my look into 9/11 was really took place in the context of this larger awakening about American history. And now what you see about 9/11 is really how advanced the political intelligence apparatus, whoever is doing this, I sometimes refer to them as SCAD networks, State Crimes Against Democracy networks, because I don't really know who they are. It's pretty clear if you go back to the Kennedy assassination that the people at the very top, and particularly Lyndon Johnson and the Secret Service and some of the FBI and CIA were clearly involved. But when you look at 9/11, it's hard to say, aside from the fact that it had to involve a lot of people, and it had to be at the very high levels in American government. Part of what has surprised me, and I hope I'm not telling everybody what they already know, but what surprised me is how effective this conspiracy theory term has become in shutting down our thinking, in preventing us from looking at, with our eyes open, events like 9/11. I mean, the reality is the buildings explode into dust. They don't just fall. They explode into billowing clouds of dust that cover Manhattan. It's amazing to look at the photos. Now, there was a helicopter flying above the Twin Towers on the day of 9/11 that took about 1,000 or so photographs. These were sequestered by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, the agency responsible for investigating the collapse of the towers. and they were not released until like 2008 or so. I mean, they held them. ABC filed a Freedom of Information Act request and got them. But when you look at those photos, it's just incredible, and it's obvious that something a lot more than a collapse happened to those buildings. And you think about it a little more. You've got these pilots that supposedly hijacked the planes. They have poor skills, flying skills. They evade the multi-layered air defenses of the most powerful superpower in the history of the world, and fly these planes into buildings, escape. They fly into the Pentagon. That's got to be the most highly protected airspace in the world. So there are all these things that you would think, God, we should be totally wondering what was up. We should have been totally suspicious that there was something wrong with the official account and there was something incomplete.
Right. Well, and I was just going to say, a lot of us on the day of the event, I was still in college, my last semester of college when it happened. I remember being as caught up in the excitement and hysteria of that day as everybody else, and so I can give people a pass for not waking up the day of, because most of us were taken off guard by that. But if thinking about it yourself didn't wake you up, if nobody noticed something amiss about it, but you did come across the evidence and then you witnessed the media's reaction to the evidence, if that doesn't wake you up, if that doesn't make you think something is afoul here, then I don't know what can you wake you up. I remember this. The media actually, through its attacks on people who were asking reasonable questions, helped wake me up to this, and look at me now. But it's taking professors who ask about the Building 7, who ask about the 100 feet of free fall, and just completely ignoring the question. And at first you might be able to say, well, maybe they just misheard, maybe their listening comprehension abilities aren't up to par. But when you start to see a pattern of this, and it becomes clear that this is a deliberate ignoring of the facts, ignoring of this big topic, that they don't even want to go there.
I think what's happened is the political class in America has developed a knee-jerk reaction to any questions about these kinds of events. And actually, most people have questions. Most people, large numbers, large percentages of people have doubts about 9/11. Large majorities of people have doubts about the official account of the Kennedy assassination. So what's happened is it's not a mass phenomenon as much. I mean, I do think that people tend to, poo-poo suspicions of elite political crime, but the source of this, really the origin of it is out of the elite class, and it's in their interest to avoid being interrogated about these matters. And they have, over a period of decades, developed very, very powerful norms against discussing these matters. And the conspiracy theory concept is extremely important in all of this because it stops the debate. I mean, all you do is say, well, that's a conspiracy theory, and that's the end of the argument. There's nobody that says, well, what's wrong with conspiracy theories? What's wrong? We know that that conspiracies happen. One of the things I do in my book is go back and look at American history, and most people don't realize this, but conspiracy thinking, conspiracy belief is as American as apple pie. It's written into the Constitution. The founders thought conspiracies would happen as a matter of course, and that you had to divide power and pit it against itself to prevent people from conspiring against the people's liberties and expanding the power of government.
Right.
The Declaration of Independence is a conspiracy theory. If you read the whole thing, the first part about inalienable rights everybody's familiar with, but the rest of it is a list of crimes that the colonists said King George had instigated to subject them to tyranny. They accused the king of stirring up Indian attacks and quartering troops in their houses to intimidate them and so on. So this conspiracy theory paranoia, phobia about thinking in conspiratorial terms, it's a fairly new phenomenon. You're probably familiar with Aaron Burr. In early history, it was called the Burr conspiracy. He was a vice president under Jefferson.
Right.
And he conspired to break off Western lands from American control. He was tried for treason. He wasn't convicted, but he was tried. And then later, because people made accusations against him, he fought a duel with Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton was killed. I mean, these people took conspiracy theory seriously. And so it's just very un-American, but it's something that happened in the United States over the last 40 to 50 years, and part of it was this conspiracy theory campaign that the CIA instigated. I call it the conspiracy theory conspiracy because it's so outrageous. I mean, you have a government agency conspiring to discredit the idea of conspiracy. It's the hypocrisy is really breathtaking. And you see how effective it is when you look at 9/11. People, if you look at the evidence, there's so many things that point to some kind of inside operation and that raise questions about the official account of the story. It's more or less obvious if you sit down and go through the evidence, and yet the government itself acts as if none of this is worth looking at, and furthermore condemns anybody who says there is. So it's been a very effective propaganda campaign by the CIA. And the other one thing I point out in the book is how the thing works. Is not only does it just shut down discussion about these events, it distorts our thinking. It makes us tend to think of these events as one at a time, as isolated incidents. So you look at the assassinations in the 60s and the political stolen election in 2000 and 2004, and the 9/11 attacks and the anthrax letter attacks, and so on. But you see these as isolated events when in reality there are a lot of connections that you would notice. If you were looking at a husband whose wife, he's married to a wealthy woman, she dies of a fall in the shower. And when that happens, you'd automatically think, I wonder if something's going on here. I mean, it's an improbable event. The woman had a lot of money. But then if you saw a second wife die of an accident at home, you would not just be suspicious. You would say, this is obvious that this person is killing his wives. You would exhume the bodies. You would do all kinds of things to investigate. So the natural tendency is to look for connections between crimes. And yet we don't do that with high crimes. We don't do that with state crimes against democracy or suspicious events, assassinations, defense failures, biochemical attacks, and so on. We don't do that. And part of the reason we don't do it is because of the conspiracy theory term. It causes us to look at one event at a time. 9/11 was directly connected with the anthrax letter attacks. And we should have been suspicious. Most people don't know this. There is a story in the Washington Post in the fall of 2001 that points out that the White House started taking Cipro, an antibiotic to prevent anthrax infection. It started taking Cipro, the vice president and others in the administration, the night of 9/11. Well, that suggests that they knew the anthrax was coming. Now, people would say, well, maybe they were doing it as a precaution. Well, if they were doing it as a precaution, why didn't they tell anybody about it? Why didn't they tell the American people? Why did they not tell the Senate, the House? 5 people died from the anthrax attacks. So it doesn't make sense that they would not have told people. Later, remember the talk of duct tape? And they said, duct tape your windows and all that. So effectively scaring everybody during these subsequent false alarms after 9/11. but we don't look at 9/11 and the anthrax letter attacks as connected, and yet they were closely connected in time, and at the time we thought they were connected. But as soon as they find out that this was a U.S. Army strain of anthrax, it gets split off. They chase after first the wrong lone anthrax letter mailer, and then another guy, Ivan, who commits suicide. Once that happens, once the people say it's domestic, we quit thinking about 9/11 and anthrax as connected. When what we should have been saying was, wait a minute, if anthrax was an American Army strain, why would we not think there's some connections with 9/11, that might be domestic too? And these guys appear to have known the anthrax was coming and started taking antibiotics, which suggests foreknowledge. I would have suggested that they go in and identify the stock trades of everybody in the biological warfare think tanks and laboratories, and that they check the stock trades of everybody in the White House. So anyway, the larger point is simply that this conspiracy theory concept has distorted our thinking to the point where we frankly don't think clearly about these matters. And it's created a lot of blind spots. And
that's right.
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt, but that is absolutely right, and that's why we need to address this point. And we're bringing up a lot of points here today, and normally we focus on the science evidence, but the science evidence, being as clear as it is, being as right out there, out front, okay, Building 7 is so clearly a controlled demolition, not just from people's own common sense and watching it fall, but also from the admitted over 100 feet of free fall. All right, the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers, the evidence has been laid out in the movies that I mentioned in the beginning. So the reason that we bring up all of these topics today is because it does show a broader picture, and it does reflect on the crime we focus on. Now, obviously, this show is independent of AE 9/11 Truth. AE 9/11 Truth just focuses on the science, so I want to clarify that as we're talking about these other things. It doesn't have an opinion on who was involved. But it is important to look at every aspect of this, and what I'm hearing and what you're telling me right now is something that I always state in the simple fact every week, is that we're not talking about a theory. We're not talking about politics here. We're talking about a murder investigation. And the fact that it's 9/11 does not make it any different. And I love the analogy you use about a guy who keeps on having wives die on him in the shower, slipping in the, she slipped and fell in the shower. I actually saw on one of those TV shows, those true life crime TV shows, where parents kept on having children die on them in some weird way, and it turned out the mother had I think it's called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and that's what it was, but they didn't know that because they kept on having kids die on them left and right. Now, you look at the bigger picture, and you step back, and you see these obvious clear issues with other events in world history, and you, instead of looking at it as an individual, you look at it as a system, then you begin to see a clearer picture of kind of what we're living under. And I heard a point raised, too, in terms of talking about other big events. Had they happened in the Soviet Union, where a guy who's running for president, let's say, and he's challenging the status quo, if he's suddenly assassinated, would we be as quick to believe the government's official story in that case, or would we be more skeptical? Well, obviously we'd be more skeptical, but we think of that as only being able to happen there, not here. We're so open, we're so free. Our media would never lie to us. If it was true, somebody would have spoke out by now. The fact is, people are speaking out right now. Experts are speaking out, and so it is coming out, but we are fighting against the media well. And I want to ask you about the media. You wrote this in your book, or in your intro to the book. Journalists who offend political elites by investigating or merely repeating popular conspiracy beliefs risk losing access to the sources on which they depend for their reporting. So I guess I want to ask you, based on that quote, I've offered my own insight on this show before, but I want yours. How do you account for all of these pundits speaking in stereo with the same slurs on cue when the controlled demolition evidence is brought up? Is it just that they're afraid of losing their sources, or does it go any deeper than that?
Oh, there's a number of things going on. I think one is obviously that they would be blackballed from access to top leaders if they impugn the integrity of the political class. So that's one very strong mechanism. Part of it is the consolidation and ownership of the media by large corporations. The people at the top, the people who own all the media and other things, have a very big stake in assuring that the government is perceived as legitimate. If there's widespread disaffection from the government, it could have far-reaching implications for the social order that these classes benefit from. So there's a very good book that came out about 4 or 5 years ago on the media and how this works. And one of the chapters dealt with the Flight 800 investigation, and the media people raised this, reporters raised this, and one of them was fired, and another was told, just, drop it, we don't want to hear this, and got the message. Gary Webb was a reporter at the Sacramento Bee who studied the Iran-Contra scandal and linked that to the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1980s and early 90s, and said, and gave good evidence that the CIA had facilitated the importation of crack cocaine so that the Contras could use the profits in their war against the democratically elected government of Nicaragua. Webb was fired at the Sacramento Bee, was hounded. He committed suicide supposedly just a year or two ago. So it's not just losing access. You get fired, you get your career ruined, you may get killed. It's a very sinister system that we're in. It's hard for people to grasp this. I know you hear people say, well, somebody would have talked. You couldn't keep it a secret, and the government couldn't do something as sophisticated as 9/11 and so on. What I tell people to that is, this government invented the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project involved 100,000 people. This was kept secret from everybody. Harry Truman, when he became president, didn't learn of the atomic bomb for a week, and he was told about it. I mean, this was a very well-kept secret. So the idea that you can't keep these kinds of secrets is ridiculous. The other thing, yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, and I was just going to add, too, is that something that I see is, well, something that disturbs me, I guess, the better way of saying it, is that the yearly press correspondence dinner, when you see just how in bed these journalists are with government, how closely tied they are, where you have somebody who is a top person in the White House under some president is now a reporter on TV. I mean, you see that with Chelsea Clinton under Bill Clinton. And I'm not saying they don't have a right to pursue whatever their dreams are, but you see now this line with personal relationships being blurred between government and reporters. And so somebody, let's say they have a journalist, and let's say we have a journalist, and let's say we have a journalist's child who is growing up into this system, whether or not they're going to top positions of the military, or they're somewhere, or they're going to be working for the White House or whatever. Now suddenly it's not just about yourself and speaking out and taking the punishment, I guess, for lack of a better word, for speaking out, but also now it affects your kids, because you've used these ties to get your family a certain status in our society. And now you're not going to jeopardize that.
That's right.
And I just see that, and it really disturbs me how in bed the media is, or the quote-unquote the mainstream media is, with our government officials, and how really they're just backing them up.
Well, and I think we need to start considering the constitutional responsibilities of the press. The press is the only constitutionally protected profession in the United States. In the First Amendment, it is specifically referred to and given freedom, in effect, to say what is the truth and report and so on. I think we've forgotten that after World War II, we tried the Nazis for a conspiracy in Nuremberg, a conspiracy to take control of the government. The first charge in the indictment was a conspiracy to take charge of the government and and then launch a series of aggressive wars. One of the people in the first Nuremberg war crimes trials who was tried, found guilty, and executed was a journalist, a guy named Stryker. He had fomented anti-Semitism and war, and he was considered a party to this conspiracy to wage aggressive war. And as I said, he was hung. We need to start thinking again in the United States about the criminal acts that are being committed by our leaders. And part of it is the journalists not looking. Part of it is 9/11, the failure by NIST to look for signs of demolition, to check the dust for signs of demolition and explosives and incendiaries. That's a crime. That is a crime. It's called nonfeasance or misfeasance, the failure to carry out your responsibilities under the law. So part of what I'm trying to do is reintroduce into our thinking about American politics a criminological approach, where we think in terms of crime, and we think it's a little different. High crimes are a little different from regular crimes. The level of proof is much lower historically, and the kinds of crimes that count. But the main idea is these people swear an oath to protect the Constitution, not to protect the American people, but to protect the Constitution. And when they fail to do so, they are guilty of high crimes, which are the greatest crimes. And so I'm hoping that we turn the spotlight a little bit on the media, but also in terms of what their responsibilities are. This is not just a casual thing. Well, they're protecting their kids, and we can understand it. We need to change our thinking about it.
Right, and it's interesting, too, because I wanted to go back to you mentioning that memo that you found from the CIA. What did the memo, you don't have to quote it verbatim, I know that'd be tough to do, but what did it say, essentially, in this memo?
It was, I've included the full memo in my book. If you can find it online, if you do a search for 1035-960, that was the dispatch, it was called. There's a number for it. And what it said was that the CIA agents should go and contact their media friends and assets. So presumably there's a network of journalists all around the world that the CIA has connections with. And it said, go to them and tell them that they should write articles rebutting anybody who claims there was a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy or criticizes the Warren Commission report. It said, now, don't do this if nobody's talking about it. So we don't want to raise an issue if it's not there. But if you hear, if you have somebody, you're reviewing a book that raises questions about this, and then it gave a list of things to say to rebut this argument. One of them was, well, there was no evidence of a conspiracy, that no further evidence had come out. That's unclear. The reality is, if you look at the Warren Commission report itself, there's evidence of a conspiracy because the gunshot wound in the president's neck and back indicate a trajectory from the front. It couldn't have been 6 stories up from the back. But this is what the memo says, is just say there's no evidence for that. But then further say that these people are in love with their own theories, are paranoid, that it wouldn't. So it was a list of things that you hear today, the same argument. This was the rebuttal was they wouldn't have done it, somebody would have talked, they weren't confident enough to do something like this. The people who say this are just trying to make money. The people who say this are under the influence of communist propagandists. That was probably the most damaging thing that they implanted in the media. One of the things that I find in the book is a case where the memo itself is, the words in the memo are used in an attack on a conspiracy theory of a book being published in London. And a White House political science advisor to the White House writes a letter to the publisher that reviewed the book, the London Times, and used virtually word for word what this memo said in certain areas. So clearly they were following a script. But it's just, it was a blueprint for rebutting questions about government intrigue, and it's more or less scripted the response to this day.
That is amazing, and this is the first I'm really hearing about this. And it's funny that I'm going to look up this memo, and I'm going to get a link up to it on 911freefall.com, because what you are saying is word for word what we hear all the time in the media. So obviously this has been laid out on a piece of paper as far back as the 60s, and it's still being used right now, the blueprint for how to attack anybody that wants an honest investigation into a mass murder. I'm just blown away by this. I can't wait to read this memo. Now, with the politicians, and I can probably guess some of what your answer is going to be in some respect, but I want to hear it. How is this any different from the media? How are politicians part of this, and in this term conspiracy theory, or groomed to use it, to incite it, to avoid addressing a real topic?
The politicians use the term and they dismiss it. You raised it a few minutes ago by saying, well, look, if it happened in Russia, we would say, gee, that looks like a conspiracy. But if it happens in America, we don't say that. The amazing thing, if you think about it for a minute, if you're worried about conspiracy beliefs and you're worried about the danger they pose to a civil society, the reality is that the citadel of conspiracy thinking is the American government. It was the American government that said the world was being taken over by communists in the 1950s, and that there was a plot, a conspiracy to take over the world, and they were infiltrating all of our government agencies, and so on. Today, the 9/11 conspiracy theory, that's the theory that the hijackers were from the Middle East and were directed by Osama bin Laden and so on. Well, that's a conspiracy theory, but nobody worries about that. That to me is kind of one of the alarming things. Is people say they're worried about conspiracy theory, but they're not. The government is the source of the most damaging conspiracy theory. The theory that Saddam Hussein tried to buy uranium in Niger and was building nuclear weapons and was conspiring to put those weapons in the hands of terrorists. That was an outrageous conspiracy theory. That was a conspiracy theory that really damaged the world and caused enormous death and destruction. And yet these people don't say anything about that. So you have to understand that the government itself now views the American people as, if not the enemy, at least not capable of protecting its own democracy. And they see themselves as protecting us from conspiracy theory, from conspiracy belief, while at the same time they propagate these beliefs. It's an Orwellian situation that we're in. But on the other hand, to some extent you can understand what is going on, that we have a very highly corporatized political process. The big business has a huge hand in it. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about is obviously very influential. And Eisenhower, said right up front that it would change the moral fiber of the country, that it affected not just the decisions about war and peace, but about our very thinking as a free people. And I'm afraid that is what has happened. The political class it has a fortress mentality. If you read the tapes, the Watergate tapes with Nixon, it's very clear that they think of themselves as, and you would think, well, the government is so powerful, they would never have any fears. Actually, they're very afraid. These people feel very insecure, and I think that they feel insecure because a lot of what they're doing is based on untruths and is based on their own personal interest and is against the interest of the people as a whole. And so as a result, they have some insecurity and they overreact I mean, look at the Snowden event, the release of these documents. Actually, we've known that we were being spied on for at least a decade. I mean, the Congress rejected the Total Information Awareness Campaign of Poindexter. Poindexter had been a criminal, had been convicted in the Iran-Contra scandal. And in like 2002 or 2003, he had come up, they'd put him back in the administration, and he had proposed this Total Information Awareness Campaign, which is what we're seeing today. But there's been a lot of evidence that this was going on.
And it's right out in the open. I mean, there's been people writing about it, and as somebody who called into C-SPAN, had asked a particular congressman, it took a guy giving up his life and making a big thing out of it to make people actually suddenly acknowledge it. And I agree with you 100%. These people are afraid. They are afraid. I actually had a person running for Congress when I confronted him about this. He said, please don't do this to me. That was his response. He was afraid. And that's what I want to stress on this show, is that these people are more afraid of you out there in the listening audience than you need to be of them. I almost believe sometimes that they put out this stuff about how much they're spying on us and about the crackdown on civil liberties to try to scare people out of speaking out. But that means you just need to speak out more. And I want to get your opinion because, you've been watching the 9/11 Truth movement for years here, just like all of us. What do you see as some of the what's been done right and what's been done wrong in forcing this issue about the controlled demolitions of the buildings to the forefront? What can we do better?
Well, I think the architects and engineers have done a tremendous job. The professionals getting together, I think your point about using science and focusing on the science is right on. Ultimately, though, this is not going to change until elites start defecting. It's amazing, really, the degree of discipline of the political class in this country. Think about the Kennedy assassination. Nobody in that family has raised doubts about it until last year. Bobby Kennedy Jr., Robert Kennedy Jr., was at a meeting in Dallas where he said that you should read the book about the unspeakable, JFK and the unspeakable, and suggested that the President Kennedy had been killed by a conspiracy. But this is like 50 years later. Right. You got that family not saying anything. And it's the same with most of these events, and 9/11 is the same thing. You're not going to get action on these until you get some elite defection. Now, the other thing I would suggest, and I'm taking this, there was in the Toronto hearings, there was a former judge from the Supreme Court of Italy, and what he kept saying was you have to bring these issues through a process that's a legal process. And so I'm thinking more and more we should be going to the United Nations. They have a court that is that even if the country being investigated opposes it, they can cause an investigation of an event like this. And that would raise an official inquiry. It wouldn't necessarily solve everything, but I think that's another avenue to consider because, ultimately we've got to get these guys under oath and in the dock. But still, that's the way we should proceed.
Absolutely. Now, this hour has gone by so fast. I'm almost sorry to have to end it, but we are out of time. I want to thank you, sir, for coming on to this program. Remember, folks, you can listen to this show, 9/11 Freefall, every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.